Hi, my name's Imogen Blood, and in this, the 10th episode of Change Talk, I'm really pleased to welcome Andrew Redfern, the outgoing Chief Executive of Framework Housing Association. In our conversation, he reflects on the changes he's seen in his 40-year career within homelessness services. Andrew's been particularly outspoken about the crisis facing supported housing and related services such as floating support. So, to mark his retirement, I was keen to hear his thoughts about what central government needs to do next. My research consultancy, IBA, has been working with Framework in the past year, carrying out evaluative research to understand the impact of Framework's housing related support services, particularly in relation to activities which might prevent the need for statutory care and support. We've just published a case study from this work exploring the commissioning of housing related support services within two-tier authorities. Andrew and I spend part of this conversation talking about what's needed in terms of clarifying local strategic responsibilities for housing related support services. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Oh, and if you do, really appreciate it if you took a moment to like or subscribe or leave a comment. Thank you. So, I'm absolutely delighted in this next episode of my Change Talk podcast to welcome Andrew Redfern to Change Talk. Andrew, you're retiring this year as from your post of as Chief Executive of Framework Housing Association, and I'm just wondering if you could start off by telling us a little bit about what Framework does.
Yes, yeah, good to be with you, Imogen. So, Framework provides a range of services to help meet the needs of homeless and other vulnerable people. So, that includes people who are at risk of being homeless, people who have been in the past, and others who are perhaps struggling to navigate all the responsibilities of life. And the services include things like street outreach to rough sleepers, emergency accommodation, specialist supported accommodation of different kinds, moving people on, so resettlement work, skills training, life skills, employment skills, helping people to prepare for the job market or for volunteering opportunities, interventions in the things that cause people's lives to be disrupted in the first place. So things like drug and alcohol treatment, mental health support, well-being support. So it's a very wide range of services. It's a broad offer, and the reason for that, I think, is traced in Framework's understanding not just of what it does, but of what it is, and its own sort of history and background and values. So the connecting thread really is the value of individuals. So the idea that if we're responding to the needs of individuals, the first thing to do is not to categorize them, but to actually look at the whole of their kind of life and their circumstances and their aspirations, and try and build responses around that, integrated responses. And what matters is not necessarily who provides those. It could be Framework, it could be a partner, it could be a statutory agency. What matters is that that happens, that we look at the individual. So that's the aspiration. And I think that in turn is a reflection of Framework's history. So we were the product of a merger of two local charities set up in Nottingham in response to rough sleeping. One of those was called Macedon, and that was set up by the local Anglican diocese, and so it was a faith-based charity. And then separate to that, there was Nottingham Help the Homeless Association, that a group of concerned individuals established, both back in the early 1970s. So there's more than a 50-year history. And the two of them merged to form Framework in 2001. And I think inherited a lot of the values of the two merging organisations. It was a very, very successful merger. And so I always think that there are these different strands. So there's that kind of faith-based strand, which really kind of values individuals. You know, if you were talking sort of theologically, you talk about people being made in the image of God, and therefore of enormous kind of value, in sort of unquantifiable value, really. But then there's also a kind of I suppose, a more of a secular sort of humanist strand to it, which is also about people and the worth and the importance of people. So that kind of emphasis on on people and on individuals is reflected, I think, in the way that we look to respond to individual needs, but also in, we try very hard, for instance, not to judge people. So, I think all of us in life, we do daft things, we make poor choices, and we're responsible for those. But I think dealing with issues as they present and being where you are, dealing with things as they are at the time, I think is a really important part of the thinking.
And very interesting. I wasn't actually aware of all of that history of your organisations.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing, but correct me if I'm wrong, that when you merged and became Framework, you also became a housing association. And obviously you are a landlord as well as a support provider, aren't you? Do you want to say a little bit more about that aspect?
Yeah. So the history is that Macedon, one of the merging organisations, got itself registered as a housing association in the late 1990s, because it recognised that it was too dependent on properties that were the cast-off of, frankly, of other housing associations. So it was doing a lot of its work in shared houses, often not of great quality, and it got itself registered in order to be able to bid for capital funds, really, from central government, the then Housing Corporation as it was. And the situation was that NHHA had a level of financial stability. It had some reserves, not enormous. NHHA was the organisation that I was the director of. Macedon had no money, but it had managed to get itself registered as a housing association. So the synergy of the two was something that was going to work, and that was, so we came together. We probably spent, the last 20 years being massive rivals of each other, and sort of not quite dissing each other, but we each thought we were better than the other, and then realizing that by coming together, we could do better. I think it was a great insight, and credit to all of those on both sides of the, who sort of made that possible. But yeah, we joined together in 2001 as a registered housing association and a registered charity, and as a company limited by a guarantee. So that's our status. But I always say that we're charity first. The first and most important thing you can say about Framework status, organisational status, is we are a charity. And we're a housing association second. Don't tell the regulator of social housing that.
Yeah.
But we're a housing association because a lot of the people that we work with are not going to be housed, certainly not in the short term, by other landlords, whether they be social landlords or private landlords. So we do it. We have to do it, and we want to do that in decent, good quality accommodation in a civilized and humane way. And that is why we're a housing association. But the housing association is something that helps us to deliver on our charitable objectives. It isn't the thing in itself, if you like.
It's a means to an end. And I've been in some of your buildings that, some of them are absolutely fabulous, aren't they? Really, high quality, purpose built. I can see why you've resisted people describing them as hostels in the past, because often, certainly the ones I've been are really nice, self-contained flats in kind of clustered type of accommodation. So some really, really good quality accommodation. So I started off by reflecting on the fact this is your outgoing year, so to speak. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes before we kind of get stuck into the whole kind of national agenda around supported housing, just reflecting really a little bit on that career that you've had, Andrew, and wondering what you see as some of the most significant changes that have happened in the provision of housing related support for people experiencing homelessness over the course of your career.
Well, my first job was in Brixton in South London, working for a small charity that was helping to resettle people from psychiatric hospitals. And all of the accommodation we provided was shared. So people had bedrooms, some people were sharing with other people, and that was considered okay. That was a kind of a norm at the time. It was decent, but it was nothing kind of, that's what it was. It was a basic offer. But probably more significantly, if people went through that process and then it didn't work, and they found themselves homeless, and a lot of people did after being discharged from long stay psychiatric hospitals, because they were very institutionalized. The options for them were things like night shelters, and sometimes sleeping rough, but sort of really, really basic provision. And that's my memory of the offer for homeless people, really, in the sort of the mid 1980s. And so I think it's good to look back over that kind of 40 years and say, well, yeah, things have really improved.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we still have night shelters. We still have winter shelters. They went pretty much out of existence for a while, but they've come back more recently because they meet a need. But overall, I think there's an expectation of something better. And that's definitely something that we in Framework have promoted. The idea that if we are valuing people, if we're taking people seriously, we're treating them as individuals, the offer that we make to them, the decency of the offer that we make to them matters, because it says something about how we view those people. So I think that has changed. I think overall the offer is better. A lot of services when I first started, were reliant on volunteers, great people doing wonderful things, but nonetheless they were volunteers. There was the occasional tragedy around that. I remember the Newby report, and I think it was in somewhere someone was killed, a volunteer in working in a shelter. So and I think there's a lot more emphasis now on sort of safety and safeguarding, and sort of how we go about doing the things that we do, and I think that's really good. There's a danger that it kind of almost like the bureaucracy takes over from the understanding of people's needs, but nonetheless, we need to do things in a professional way. So that's improved. And I think during the sort of period, probably from about 2000 to around about 2010, 2012, there was a real step change in the quality of provision when we had the Supporting People programme, which for the first time clearly identified a source of funding and a process for commissioning support services, not just supported housing, but things like complementary things like floating support and homelessness prevention work. That was a really exciting time, and for us it happened just after our merger, so there was really kind of there's a lot of good things happening, not just within Framework, but in similar organisations, in the partnerships that were formed, that really improved not just the physical quality of the offer, but the specialism of the staff who were providing it. So that for the first time probably ever, they were reasonably paid. You could sort of compare that to things like social work or other kind of professional roles, and it might not have been paid quite as much, but it was competitive. So it was really really exciting, and I think achieved an enormous amount. And we saw reductions in homelessness, we saw huge reductions in rough sleeping, and I think more options, for instance, for people say leaving institutions, leaving prisons, alternatives to care homes, serious sort of resettlement processes going on that recognised that it might be a journey for people, and that the destination might be different according to who the person was. So really, really good stuff. And another thing I loved about it was it enabled public sector, private sector, and voluntary organisations like Framework to work together. They were able to both compete and cooperate at the same time within that commissioning environment in quite an interesting way. So, yeah, my regret is that we've lost so much of that. It hasn't gone back to how it was in the 1980s. We've still got, we've still got some of the things that were achieved then, but we've lost a lot of it. And I think, truthfully, supported housing finds itself now in crisis. A lot of the floating support has gone, which is really, really tragic. We have a housing first concept, which also I think has a role to play. But again, a lot of the services that are developed being described as housing first end up not being there. They end up being something else. So the whole thing, isn't in a good place, and I think that's really, really regrettable, and I think it's a missed opportunity
Yeah.
for for us as a society and a community, because we can do better than this.
Yeah, and tell us a little bit then about some of those challenges. I mean, obviously you talked about the demise of some of those sort of really strong place-based partnerships, and that being quite key. I mean, obviously your work is still the support in your services is still commissioned by local authorities, but I know that's become sort of ever tighter, really. And you've touched, of course, on the workforce. Just run us through what sort of impact some of those challenges and of course all of this has happened within the context of increasing austerity right across all of our public sector services in the last decade or 15 years or so now, isn't it? So just describe to us what sort of place services like yours are in at the moment.
I think services are struggling to survive, and quite a lot of them haven't survived.
Mm.
Particularly services run by smaller organisations that maybe don't have, quite the resilience that the larger ones have. I think have kind of gone by the board, and that's not necessarily because they're bad services. Many of them are have been very specialist and very kind of people focused services. So there's been that, and we've seen bigger, some of the mainstream housing associations withdrawing either from some aspects of supported housing or in some cases all, and that's a shame because they have something to bring too. But in terms of services that have survived, like most of ours, not all of ours, many of them have had no increase in their contract values, their housing related support contract values, even since 2010. So that's 15 years of inflation, sometimes at 1 or 2%, but sometimes at 6 or 8% or even more. And cumulatively, the impact of that is a massive erosion of value in those contracts. And organisations trying to sustain services have had to find ways of absorbing that, and so it's constant sort of remodeling, reworking. We at one stage had to actually have an outright reduction in people's salaries, even as inflation was eroding their value as well, just in order to sort of keep things going. So, and what that then means is that we're more and more reliant on the goodwill of staff, particularly staff who are experienced, who've got that kind of expertise that we're looking for. But goodwill, doesn't pay people's bills.
Of course.
And in the end, for some people, that they have moved on. They've moved on maybe to better paid but less onerous jobs in the statutory sector, 9-to-5 jobs rather than ones that involve them, working weekends and nights, and sometimes even to, something completely different. There's this, I think it might be a little bit of a cliche that you can earn more stacking shelves in a supermarket, but it's pretty much true.
Certainly
And
less emotionally taxing, isn't it, generally speaking?
absolutely, yeah, and not materially different in terms of the financial rewards.
Yeah.
So, yeah, recruiting and holding on to the kind of staff that we need is an enormous challenge in supported housing, particularly given that there are now fewer of them because rotas have been reduced, staffing establishments have been reduced, and at the same time, the profile of the presenting needs group has grown. So it's in terms of both numerically, but also the needs that people present with. So I think homelessness and mental health have always been, or mental ill health have always been quite closely associated, and similarly alcohol misuse. But we now have the added component of illegal substances, more and more different kind of versions of them, kind of synthetic opioids and things like that, which are further kind of a new dimension in the client group. We have more care leavers than we've had before. We have people who've left the armed forces and found themselves in a very different sort of life, which they've struggled to cope with. And then more recently, we've had early prison releases. Some of those people have, regardless of the plan, have been released to homelessness. And then we've had, asylum seekers, and where people are granted leave to remain, sometimes that results in them losing their home office accommodation. Again, some of those people have found themselves homeless. So all of these kind of superimposed layers of complexity on the issue, at the same time as the services that are there to respond, have been kind of, I don't know if there's such a word as genericized. But what I mean by it is the opposite of specialised. So they're dumbing down almost, is what I would say. So people keeping services going, but knowing that they're not actually providing that sophistication and that specialism that they really need to be to respond to this complexity and this diversity of need. And I think it's a very, very serious situation.
Having to work with that huge range of needs, support needs that you described, with a workforce who, by definition, are underpaid, undervalued, and overstretched, and not having that kind of specialist resource that, I seem to remember we did have quite a bit in supported housing. In previous decades, you might have a specialist drug worker, or you might have somebody dedicated to resettlement work, or you had, a kind of mental health specialist within your team. It's very different now, isn't it? If you're trying to obviously draw in assistance from those very, really overstretched mental health services, it's really, really tough, isn't it? And
Yes, and I think one of the things that drives that is the perception that supported housing is essentially a low level offer. It's for people who are sort of just struggling a little bit to sort of keep a roof over their head, but it's essentially a housing issue, and it's absolutely not. An increasing proportion of the people who find themselves in these services, if you did a proper Care Act assessment, for instance, you would find that they easily meet the eligibility criteria for support, not necessarily regulated care, but for support or care delivered by the local authority. That's an argument that's really hard to make. It's often not accepted, but it's to anybody that spends any time in supported housing, you realise it's palpably true. And similarly, those health issues as well. A lot of quite complex health issues. I think more recently, we're seeing more people, for instance, with physical disabilities in our services.
Very striking.
And again, we're sort of having to work out how to adapt to that. So, yes, increasing complexity of need with sadly less resource to meet it in the way that we would like to do. And that is, to me, that's a source of enormous concern.
Yeah, I think it's really, really interesting that you reflected at the start about trying to resist categorization of people, but we've sort of ended up, haven't we, with a kind of homelessness pathway, for want of a better word, which draws in such a range of people, and really, from pieces of work we've done, looking at sort of mental health supported housing pathways. Actually, there's often a really blurred distinction between people who who ends up where, really, whether you end up in a kind of health and social care funded Section 117 kind of pathway through mental health services, or whether you somehow get deemed to be the responsibility of the housing authority ultimately. And it feels often quite kind of blurred and quite ambiguous as to who ends up where and who gets which resource as a result. I think that's something which I've been really struck by in recent years.
Yes, I think there is an element of chance about the pathway that people find themselves in, and therefore the status they have. And there's this phrase that always strikes me as odd, which is, are they known to statutory mental health services? Are they known? Well, and it always thinks, well, whether they're known or not, if they're not known, you
They
need to
should
get
be.
to know them if they've actually got the relevant needs. So yes, there does seem to. I guess it's an inevitable consequence of finite resource, and organisations, particularly statutory organisations, needing to manage their budgets and therefore desperately not wanting to take on responsibility for people that they think they shouldn't be responsible for because somebody else needs to be. But from the perspective of, from a non-statutory perspective like ours, it's really hard to comprehend because, you start off, we would start off, I think, saying, well, there's an individual here. Let's look at that individual's needs and let's try and kind of build the appropriate response, recognizing that that response is never going to be perfect because knowledge and resources, of course, they are finite. But it doesn't seem very rational always, the way in which we go about deciding who gets what service and when and how.
Yeah. And just thinking about, I suppose the sort of some of the national narrative really about supported housing in recent years. I mean, one of the things that has obviously, rightly in many ways caught a lot of public and political attention is, I guess, the rise of this, let's call it a non-commissioned sector of supported housing. And of course, that's prompted a recent private members bill. It's kind of prompted a piece of legislation to supposedly give local authorities more oversight, which we're still yet to see implemented. But I'm just wondering what your sort of take is on that part of the sector, really, and what's causing it and what's needed, really, to kind of try and respond to that.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that if we are not happy with the services that are there, that exist, and I'm certainly not happy with them, the best response is to commission better ones. So if we commission better services, then the need for the substandard ones that are part of the part of the system at the moment disappears, and service users aren't daft. Service users will choose the services that better meet their needs. So the question we ought to be asking ourselves is why have these inverted commas rogue providers emerged? What's the gap? And it's basically a gap in, for want of a better word, the market that they have emerged to fill, because when we lost supporting people and we lost that kind of very structured commissioning environment, there were provision disappeared and new offers emerged to fill that gap. And not all of those organisations are rogues. Some of the providers are sort of businesses masquerading as charities and sort of making an abnormal profit from providing a very low quality service, and we ought to be trying to get rid of that. But there are also some public spirited people who are trying to do the best that they can in very, very difficult circumstances and with very limited resources. And therefore we can look at their offer and say, well, that's not really good enough, but it's not going to be because they don't have what they need to do it better. And actually, that's not just true of them, that's true of most supported housing. So including the services that Framework provides. There was recently a consultation on the implementation of the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, and the forward to it by the two relevant ministers, Rushanara Ali, who now isn't the Homelessness Minister, and Stephen Timms from DWP, who is a good guy always has been in my view. But the forward that they either wrote together or was written for them hugely irritated me, because it gave the impression that all was well in the garden of supported housing, except for these rogue providers who were kind of spoiling it for everyone else. And that if only we could deal with that problem, everything would be fine. And that's such a simplistic, ill-informed view. And I can't believe that whoever it was that wrote that really believed it. The reality is that the whole field of supported housing, some people say sector, I don't like to use that word particularly, but supported housing and related services, floating support, housing first, homelessness prevention, are are vastly and chronically underfunded, and they are in crisis. And the existence of these rogue providers is just one symptom of that.
Yeah.
But it is a symptom, it's not a cause. And we need to address the cause. And addressing the cause means facing up to the hard reality that if you want support to be good, someone has to pay for it.
Yeah.
And at the moment, no one's paying for support. So how we can expect good quality support if no one wants to pay for it, I don't know. Absolutely, there are constraints. As I think it was Theresa May said, well, there's no magic money tree, and there isn't. But the key to delivering public services well and cost effectively is following the evidence. And there is plenty of evidence, in my view. There needs to be more, and organisations like yours, Imogen, do a great job in trying to build that evidence base around what works and what doesn't work. But I think we do have sufficient evidence to tell us that supported housing and related services, when done well and when properly resourced, are the best way of meeting a whole range of needs among some of the most vulnerable people in our community. And not following that evidence, doing something different, is actually a way of wasting public money rather than a way of saving it.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, what you've described there with the sort of non-commissioned provision, I mean, it's it's a kind of market response, isn't it? We've got a broken supported housing market. That's not to say there aren't, of course, excellent providers within it, but when we think about the way in which our procurement is driving the whole industry, the sort of competition that creates between providers, the kind of very transactional status, the kind of obviously, huge reductions in some instances, in some areas, almost like complete decommissioning of support, actually. And, it's this, yet, as you say, we're facing huge demand, and it's a kind of simple, cause and effect, demand and supply case that a number of providers, some of whom were previously commissioned, actually, are now sort of trying to run on, very housing benefit heavy models, and that's simply created a sort of shunt in the costing around government, hasn't it? Which with no real kind of sense of where that's going or what the quality is. So yeah, it's not sort of. I think, as we've reflected before, whilst regulation may be necessary, it's not sufficient to deal with these issues, is it actually? And depending on how that's implemented, it could well just push more really hard pressed, high quality providers out of the market, which is the last thing we need.
I think that will happen
Yeah.
unless there is a rethink.
Mm.
I mean, on the point about regulation, one of the frustrations in the loss of supporting people was that programme came with it
Oh, yeah.
a whole structure
Mm.
of quality assessment and outcome monitoring and challenges, really, to sort of continuously improve services.
Mm.
And I'm not one of those people who thinks that competition is necessarily a bad thing. I think competition has its place in a well-organized, well-structured market. And there was an element of competition there, which, could, when done well, actually produce some better outcomes. So we're trying to kind of reinvent something that we once had and lost.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I remember the days when everyone used to send their returns into St Andrews University, didn't they? And we did. We were on the brink there of building quite an exciting national evidence base about supported housing. And as you rightly point out, now we're in a place where providers of supported housing, sometimes commission independent organisations like ourselves to carry out research. But we're all having to start from scratch, and often just do a piece of work within one service, or with whoever we can rally at the time. And yet we had that infrastructure there to create that kind of national evidence base, which is really frustrating. Yeah.
I think it's one of my reflections would be that in terms of a lot of the issues that organisations like ours, in partnership with others and in partnership with statutory agencies, and we couldn't work without them. I mean, some fantastic people over the years that we've partnered with in councils and in central government. But a lot of the answers we know the answers. It's not as if we don't know what to do. In terms of a lot of homelessness, we could prevent it. We know how to do it. In terms of a lot of rough sleeping, we know we know how it can be tackled and brought down to, incredibly low levels. It's not that we don't have the answers. It's that we do have the answers and we don't implement them anymore. And I find that, deeply frustrating.
Of course, absolutely. And
There's so many social problems
yeah.
and economic problems that we don't have the answers to. So let's at least use the answers where we do know what they are, and then we might be able to concentrate a bit more on the more intractable ones.
Absolutely. And I'm going to be focusing in another episode of Change Talk, talking to Penelope Green, who has had a long history of the civil service before moving into supported housing. And we're going to be thinking a little bit about why it is that the government really finds it so difficult to kind of bring together what, of course, does require a really sort of cross-departmental response. And I guess the clue is in that very sort of heading. But you're right, it's really frustrating to be in this kind of organisational memory lapse, isn't it, nationally?
I mean, on that point about sort of cross-departmental, there are also agencies of government involved in this as well. So, for instance, organisations like Homes England or the Regulator of Social Housing and the CQC. So it's government departments, and it's also those sort of agencies too. And I remember a conversation I had 6 or 7 years ago with quite a senior person in one of those agencies. And I said, we need a champion. We need a champion for supported housing in government that's prepared to actually sort of, set out the stall, take the lead, and say, well, we're gonna tackle this. We're gonna try and bring people together. Would your agency be prepared to do that? And the alarm bells that went up in response was sort of, oh, I don't think we'd be able to do that. It's just, it's just one of those things, just in the too hard basket, this one. Nobody wants to touch this because it's just too difficult.
Yeah.
And I accept that in governmental and administrative terms, there are some tough issues to deal with. But don't we actually need politicians or civil servants that are prepared to actually sort of step up to the plate and say, yeah, actually, there is something here where for relatively little cost. I mean, supporting people cost 1/3 of all central government expenditure. That's 1/3 of 1% for all the impacts that it had across so many areas. We need a department or maybe an individual, to sort of stand up and say, yeah, listen, we need to sort this out, and it's going to come out of the too hard basket and into the we are going to do this basket. And yes, of course, corralling other departments, because the Department of Health needs to be involved, the Department of Justice needs to be involved, DWP, MHCLG, and of course the Treasury. And that's probably the hardest nut to crack. But it is worth investing in this, and it does save public money, not just in the long term, but in the short term, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've noted your own irritation with all of this, and I think it's fair to say, Andrew, that you've been quite outspoken about these challenges in recent years. I mean, you're in good company. Obviously, there's a substantial lobby going on, being led by several lobbies being led by National Housing Federation and their Save Our Supported Housing campaign. You've got the Homeless Link and was it Keep Our Doors Open. There's a number of campaigns going on. You're certainly not the sole voice, but you have been increasingly outspoken about that. I just wondered, just to sort of have a side reflection for a moment in terms of your sort of leadership, what kind of prompted that, and do you feel it's made an impact?
I've surprised myself a little bit because in general, I've sort of promoted the idea of partnership, and that, charities and voluntary organisations should they should always look to speak truth to power, but not in a sort of militant or irresponsible or unrealistic way. And I think for most of the time when I've led framework, that's been the approach that I've favoured and still do in many respects. People who are commissioners in local authorities or people with statutory housing responsibilities or care responsibilities, they have a job to do. They do that within constraints. They have political pressures, all of those things. We have to understand and respect that and sort of work within those parameters and try to basically help each other to achieve shared objectives. So I'm all in favor of that. I think on this issue I have just been, I suppose, radicalized by the neglect, by and by the whole story. The story that starts off with government having something that works and doesn't cost it that much money, deciding to not even deciding to jettison it, just almost kind of letting it be jettisoned, then saying, "Oh dear, isn't this awful?" When the inevitable consequences happen, we say, "Oh dear, isn't this awful? What are we going to do about it?" Well, here's something, so let's do that, rather than thinking, well, analysing what the problem is, what's caused it, and therefore, what needs to happen. Just doing any old thing, and rush into the kind of, oh, we need more regulation. And this fundamentally is not a regulatory issue. The failure here is one of strategy and policy. And we're all kind of part of that failure, but fundamentally we cannot solve this without central government rethinking. And that's been obvious, I think, for at least 10 years. And that reality, particularly that bit about who pays for support, has been ignored.
Yeah.
What makes me cross, it's not even the fact that government might say, oh, well, we haven't got the money to pay for this. We can't pay for it. It's the unwillingness to even recognise the issue, even to acknowledge the problem. So that forward to the consultation, and the whole consultation itself simply ignored the question, who pays for support? That is the fundamental question. I wouldn't mind so much if we agreed that was the fundamental question, and then we said, but we don't have an answer to it. That would be a step forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
We could then start saying, well, what might the answer be? We don't even get to that stage. It's kind of, let's just ignore this again because it's too hard. And yeah, that's made me really cross, and I've expressed that, and I hope I've always expressed that in an appropriate way. But to be honest, even if sometimes it's been less than appropriate, then I'm not that bothered, because I actually think it's scandalous that this has been allowed to happen, and I think it needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved quickly. And whoever is the next homelessness and supported housing minister, it should be absolutely at the top of that person's priority list.
Absolutely. And of course, in the, when we heard the comprehensive spending review this year, we got some, great news in terms of, more funding for the development of social housing, which of course is massively part of the problem. But as you say, it's by no means the whole problem, is it? And, there was, again, no sort of no mention really of support and what that might look like. So that felt like another missed opportunity. I'm just wondering then, what do you think needs to happen at a national government level at this stage? If you were that next homelessness and housing, so a supported housing minister, what would you be proposing?
Well, for instance, we've got the Department of Health carrying out its creating its 10-year plan for health.
Yeah.
We know that one of the issues it grapples with all the time is hospital discharge, the difficulty of getting people out of hospital because often there aren't suitable places for them to go that can meet their support and care needs. Another issue it grapples with is the pressure on emergency services and indeed GP services as well. In an NHS budget that I don't even know what the NHS budget is. I want to say something like 150 billion a year or something. I struggle to believe that there isn't a very strong case for making some contribution towards the proper resourcing of supported housing. It might be £500 million a year or something, but it seems to me that the case is there. You can make a similar argument for the Ministry of Justice around prison discharge. We know that the difficulties that the government is facing around capacity in prison places. It's building some more, but it's had to release people early. There's about to be yet another rethink of how probation services are delivered, following the disaster that happened when they were sort of all hived off.
Debunked. Yeah.
And so it's been rethought again. Supported housing has to be part of that, and the possibility, the financial case to make for making a contribution towards the cost, I think is there, and it needs to be addressed. Ditto in MHCLG. Clearly, what was the Supporting People programme was an MHCLG budget. That money's, I think, effectively being subsumed within wider council budgets, and its identity has been lost. But MHCLG does still invest money in, for instance, tackling rough sleeping and tackling homelessness. I think there's a real argument that could be done more strategically through through an ongoing programme. So if you look at at all of those departments, I suspect DWP would say they're probably contributing enough already through the housing benefit system. The really, really important thing there is that DWP stops these periodic raids on supported housing, these periodic attempts to reduce its bill. Some of those cause utter chaos. So I think it was in 2022, there was new guidance around claims in exempt accommodation. That's been incredibly problematic to implement. It's caused some enormous difficulties with people losing, often in very great levels of need, having their benefit cut off because of new bureaucratic processes. So my urge to DWP would just stop doing that, give us some stability, while the other departments maybe try and formulate a solution. And I think the case also needs to be made to Treasury for some more money. It doesn't need to be a huge amount, I suspect, to sort of begin the process of turning this around. We all know that the public finances are immensely constrained. The solution to that has to be about spending money better and more wisely. And as I said, driven by evidence. And I think there is a strong evidence-based case that when we used to invest in this, it worked and it saved money, and I think it would do again.
No, that's really clear. And I mean, it's a sort of strategic level. Of course, we've also seen a huge kind of movement of localism over, the time that we're thinking about, the time span, the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years. And, I can see kind of wins and losses in that. I suppose I'm just wondering, certainly from what you're saying, a kind of national funding pot, presumably with like ring-fenced funding allocations going out, presumably via local authorities or kind of based partnerships. I'm just thinking about in terms of the sort of strategic kind of planning of supported housing, presumably that should still sit within those local places. Do you think national government, has a role to play in sort of stipulating what that sort of strategy should look like? How do you sit on that?
I think one of the few benefits we are seeing as a result of the Supported Housing Regulatory Oversight Act is the requirement for local authorities to develop supported housing strategies, and I think that is positive. A concern that I have is that that's vested at the moment in housing authorities.
Yes.
It's back to that thing. It's seen as primarily a housing issue, and local authorities have different statutory responsibilities. So, in a two-tier system, for instance, districts and boroughs have housing responsibilities, housing and homelessness responsibilities. County councils, second-tier authorities, have support and care responsibilities in public health. So, how you bring those together, I think is something of a challenge. it may be that I think that vesting supported housing strategies in districts and boroughs, that's too low a level, that's
Yeah.
too localised. Um, and I think so many of these issues go across local authority areas. So I hope that perhaps in local government reorganisation, there might be a way to address this. But again, I think it needs to be clearly faced up. Central government needs to face up to this clearly and say it's got to be vested somewhere, and we can't be vague about it. So it's no good saying something like, well, let the local agencies work it out together according to their own particular needs. You'll just get a real kind of postcode lottery by
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah.
And I would argue that if we're going to have new unitary authorities where the housing responsibility and the support and care responsibility combined within one organisation, that would be the place to vest the creation of a supported housing strategy. It does raise the question where you have combined authorities with mayors, what should their role be? And we've got different models there. So, for instance, in Manchester with Andy Burnham, there's been quite a lot of proactivity, I think,
Yeah.
around homelessness and rough sleeping, and I think also probably in places like Birmingham as well. Um, there are other areas where we've got combined authorities where very little has happened around homelessness and rough sleeping. So somehow I think I would vest the responsibility at the unitary level of local government, and then perhaps give the combined authorities a sort of a coordinating role, perhaps a knocking heads together type role.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
we say, actually some of these issues are cross authority
Yeah.
because homeless people particularly and vulnerable people often generally don't necessarily understand or respect local authority boundaries. They will go to where the services are, and that requires some level of coordination. So I think perhaps combined authorities would be the place to vest that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely some sort of strategic coordination where there are, perhaps kind of niche services that maybe you don't need one in every local authority, but a large area like Greater Manchester or Greater London, needs at least one, if not several services. And obviously, the Greater London Authority, GMCA up here are well placed to kind of coordinate and make that happen, aren't they? And to
Yeah.
sort of try and look at getting those kind of frameworks across whole areas. Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I guess it gives us a perfect cue to just talk a little bit in these last few minutes about the piece of work that we've just recently done for you, Andrew, which involved a piece of research, I guess, kind of evaluative research. We were looking at the impact which your supported housing and housing related services, i.e., floating support in one county council area, about the impact that those were having, both on the individuals being supported in those services and on, some of those themes we've talked about today, the potential impact on criminal justice, on mental health, and on all of those different statutory responsibilities. We particularly looked at this question around, I suppose, the sort of invisibility of some of those Care Act needs, which, given my own background in social work, I'm particularly interested in sort of unearthing and growing our evidence base around. But the piece that we've actually kind of nationally published is actually effectively a case study, really looking and focusing on these kind of issues within two-tier authorities. I mean, I know lots of people have said to me in the past, I'm in a unitary authority and it's still incredibly difficult
Yes.
in the absence of
Solve everything.
clarity and funding and all the rest of it. I know it can be a nightmare still in a unitary authority to kind of divvy up these responsibilities, and you get commissioners sitting in all sorts of different parts of authorities, and it can be super messy. But nevertheless, the case study really does kind of, I think, tell a story of good practice actually within an incredibly complex political system. That in this particular case study, which I won't, we won't name the authority, but there's been, an ongoing commitment to fund the services which you deliver in partnership with NACRO and Amplius and Salvation Army, and to keep kind of funding those with some input from public health, And you've got, the districts have all kind of joined together and written a homelessness strategy. There's a kind of agreed process whereby they all kind of refer into your services, and a way of making sure that they're not just referring people in housing need who don't have a support need. And obviously you as a lead provider are working really hard with a number of kind of ways of you've got a kind of common approach to assessment, and you're kind of educating all of those district providers, and the relationships generally seem about as good as they get. Yet nevertheless, it's an incredibly precarious situation, isn't it? Not just from a funding perspective, but also in terms of who's responsible for what and who has oversight. Do you want to just kind of fill in the gaps in that, really, and tell us from your perspective what you think is really challenging about that arrangement?
Well, as you say, Imogen, there's a lot in that report to celebrate.
Of course, yeah.
There's a lot of very, very good partnership working, and and individuals and organisations who've promoted that in the statutory sector as well as in the voluntary sector. And the sad thing really is that it is under threat. It's precarious, and it's precarious because, frankly, everyone wants someone else to pay for it.
Yes, quite.
And that's understandable given the constraints that organisations face. And this is why central government must address this question: who funds housing related support, and where are they supposed to get the money from? But in the meantime, I think the case study illustrates some of the tensions of trying to do this work in partnership in a two-tier local government setup. And I recognise what you say, that even in unitary areas this stuff can be challenging, but I think there are some particular challenges whether in the two-tier areas where those responsibilities are split between organisations, and especially with homelessness in one place and support and care and public health in another. So I think what the case study illustrates is the value of services that can be delivered, but also how much more would be possible if we had a stronger central focus on the value of this kind of work, and institutional arrangements that make the partnership easier. And that's why I think it's so important in the context of local government reorganisation that supported housing doesn't stay in that too hard basket, but is seen as something that will be enormously affected by the outcomes of local government reorganisation, and some attention is paid to where is it going to be vested, how will it be resourced, how are those arrangements that exist now not just to be continued but to be enhanced so that they can work better. And those opportunities absolutely exist. And I think the case study which you've produced so well, and which we are about to publish, I think sort of really illustrates those issues very well, both the threat and also the opportunities. They're both there, and what we need to do is build on the opportunities and sort of see off the threat.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said right at the start of the conversation, homelessness isn't either just a housing problem or just a support problem, is it? It's clearly both. And when you speak to individuals and hear their stories, you can hear elements of both housing journeys that have gone wrong in highly challenging times, where there just isn't enough support, enough social housing, but also of huge kind of support needs and trauma and all the sorts of issues that you talked about at the start. And actually for one authority to be trying to solve this with just the housing but not access to the care and support, and another trying to sort of solve it without access to or really understanding of the housing legislation or how that's worked and how they is just impossible, isn't it? We're trying to deal with
I think you put it a lot better than I could there, actually,
yeah.
Imogen.
Yeah, and you see that at central government level as well. We're trying to solve or create some kind of exit for people who need a kind of integrated, holistic solution, and yet we're each just seeing little bits of the elephant, aren't we, and bringing different bits of that. And there isn't enough elephant to go round, if I can stretch that metaphor kind of even further. So yeah, no, I think that's been extremely helpful, Andrew. Thank you very much for sharing, reflecting on your career and some of the changes, and giving us that kind of really powerful steer really around what's needed nationally. And I know you've got another few months to go, but just I guess it kind of just remains for me to wish you a very, very happy retirement.
Well, that's really kind of you, Imogen. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to your podcast, and good luck both with the podcast and also with all of the work that you do, because that research, that evidence base that you help to build for these and similar services, I think is going to be really, really important, even more important going forward. And you do a great job with that, and good luck with that in the future as well.
Oh, thank you very much. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.